for the talk, but also taking time out of your busy schedules to join us as well too for this tour. It really is an amazing opportunity to see all of you and some very familiar faces as well too. First off, I want to thank the Westminster Museum and Archives, Michelle, Rob, Juana, you and your entire teams for being such great partners on this exhibit, The Ocean of Peace. I can see from the video screen that there's some familiar faces there. Of course, Mrs. Puri, so nice to see you again as well. Hello, thank you for being such a wealth of knowledge, and hopefully we can draw some of the stories that our participants have had, as some of the people on the video have had as well too, as we take you on this tour of this exhibit that was almost a year in its making. But before I go too deeply into that, Paneet, I'd like to offer some words from you, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Westminster Museum and Archives. Putting this exhibition together was an incredible experience. Naveen and I have both worked in this space for quite some time. Naveen longer than I, and more acclaimed than I. But we've always had these kind of stories of New Westminster on the periphery. For myself, I live just on the other side of the border in Burnaby, and I grew up in this community. So this opportunity to go across generations and different phases of the Gurdwara and the community and really develop this intimate relationship with all of these stories was an incredible experience. So we're so glad that Arvinderji is here to join us today. And of course, Nasibji, if you're up to it to share some stories, that would be incredible. You're more than welcome. We'll definitely make the offer sometimes during our walk-in talk through the exhibition. But again, thank you so much for joining, and I think we're ready to kick it off, right, Naveen?
That sounds great, Paneet. And as Paneet mentioned, the story of the New Westminster Gurdwara was in some ways on the periphery of some more, how should I say this, perhaps better known or famous stories, especially around the Gurdwara that was in Vancouver. But New Westminster has a really rich history and its own story to share. And so in terms of context, the making of this exhibit involved almost a year of community consultations that involved close to 200 people to gather the stories of the New Westminster Gurdwara, but not only gather the stories, but gather the stories across different generations to see what the narratives were like, what the experiences were like at the Gurdwara in the early years, and then in the 50s, and how it changed in the 70s, in the 90s, and then today as well too. So as one goes through the exhibit, and I'm lucky to see that Paneet has the computer, the camera on a dolly, so we can make our way through the exhibit. We can see some of those changing narratives and changing experiences as well too. And we really are indebted to the community for helping us build this exhibition, to curate it with us by allowing us to share their stories, share their artifacts, share their documents, and in many ways guide us on what were some of the major themes of the exhibit. And a few of them that we want to highlight off the top that I think we want to be emphasizing. One is the story of gender. And we really want to be focused on the wealth of information that the women, the South Asian elders and South Asian women have provided to build this exhibition out and make sure that their stories were centralized. And we were really lucky to have such strong voices help guide us in allowing that story to come to the forefront. And this is really a space for some of those stories to live and be shared and be reflected upon. But we also want to focus on this idea of what it means to be Canadian. And I think what you may see here is the Gurdwara was this focal point of where some people felt at home, some people felt that they could be a South Asian or Sikh, but also a place where they negotiated what some of the difficulties they had in their home life, in their school life, versus that comfort that many felt at the Gurdwara. It's called an Ocean of Peace. It's a play on words of the Sukh Sagar Gurdwara, which literally means an ocean of peace. And we wanted to bring that space into the Gurdwara space. And I want to touch upon quickly here some of the architectural design elements before we talk about the exhibit itself. The archway that you see here where Paneet is at, this is the entryway into the exhibit space. And I want to thank Rob and the New Westminster Museum and Archives and their team for building this space that is really evocative of entering a new social space. And as we go through the archway and into the Gurdwara space, you'll notice that there is a banner that runs across the top of the walls. And this is taken directly from the old archival photographs that we had of the interior of the New Westminster Gurdwara. There is religious words taken that are placed there in the same color scheme, in the same font, to create that sense of evocation of the past. And I want to thank two people here. One is Anu Chauhan, also known as Anumation, who designed and graphic designed our entire exhibit for us. We're really lucky to have her insight and her help in this. And she was able to look at those old photographs and remake that design that lives on the interior of this space. And along with that, it became a conversation topic. So I really wanted to thank the people who came to the opening of the exhibit all the way back in January when we did this. Just because once they walked in and saw that image again, it brought back so many memories that were shared on the spot. Paneet, do you have anything you want to add here?
Yeah, so as Naveen put it, the choices that were made for the design of the space, of course, Anu, the graphic designer, Joe, who designed the space, did an incredible job. And their teams with bringing the space to life as not just a museum space where we're talking about a Gurdwara, but how do we bring this Gurdwara atmosphere to life in a museum space? So this aesthetic that you see, probably the longest period of time, the Gurdwara looked like this. From 1975 was when the current building was built. And from 1975 until 2013, if you walk into the Gurdwara, this is what it looked like, essentially, with the design elements. This blue carpet is eerily similar to what it used to look like. And of course, Naveen talked about the banner as well. But also the layout of the space was something we paid attention to in this. So the exhibition space is built into two parts. There is the part that feels like the darbar, or the congregation hall, where a lot of the events and a lot of spiritual activity take place. But then there's also a section of the space that resembles the classrooms and the langar hall, or the dining hall. And the reason for that is because so much of the activity at the Gurdwara happens there. When you talk to people, you're talking while you're sharing food in the langar hall. A lot of these experiences growing up, I know both Mrs. Puri and Mrs. Arvinder Kaur have talked about being in Punjabi classes growing up, and of course how it used to happen in the langar hall or their homes, or as they've gone on, they've actually built classrooms. So the other half is dedicated towards that the atmosphere of the classroom. And so when you walk into the space, you probably can't hear it now because of the streaming, you can only hear my voice, but you're greeted with the sounds of the Gurdwara as well. So either there will be kirtan, which is devotional singing, or they're playing some of it from across the past 6 decades that we've had recordings for, some recordings of children singing, things that they've learned in Punjabi school, and then some atmospheric sound of just the classroom and the langar hall as well. The pots and pans clanging together as they're being washed, the people serving the food as they're chanting excerpts from Gurbani or the writings of the Gurus at the same time, and teachers yelling at students who won't sit down and listen. So you get kind of the whole feeling of being inside the different spaces of the Gurdwara in this one space was kind of the goal here.
I just wanted to build on that point, and Paneet, maybe as I'm talking, you can move the camera to the right to talk a bit about the timeline, because there's a landscape that we tried to create in the exhibit, but also a soundscape as well too that is evocative of what the Gurdwara would have been like, and the everydayness of the Gurdwara, whether it's, as Paneet mentioned, religious, but also the social gathering spaces. I want to touch upon the timeline here, for one, because it speaks to some of the major moments in the history of the Gurdwara, activism in the community, and the community events and milestones. And Paneet, as you pan across this timeline, many can see that there's images that maybe resonate for us. The arrival of the first Sikhs to North America, the Kamagara Maru story, personal stories of family gatherings. And I'm curious, Paneet, I would invite you to perhaps tell us a story about the origins of the New Westminster Gurdwara. How did it start?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at the top of the timeline here, we can see we divided into three kind of categories. There's Gurdwara leadership and the congregation, the activism and politics, and then community programs, events, and milestones. But if you look here at the top, it's an image of a man by the name of Baba Sundar Singh. And Baba Sundar Singh, as well as a gentleman by the name of Bhai Bishan Singh, were the founders of the New Westminster Gurdwara to a time going all the way back to 1914. Now, I know we say that, or 1913 rather, and I know that we've celebrated 1919 as the date, as the opening of the Gurdwara, because that's the day that the Gurdwara was considered formally open. But we know of the Gurdwara existing all the way up to the point of 1913, or from the point of 1913. So Baba Sundar Singh and Bhai Bishan Singh were the founders of the Gurdwara who really got it started. But if you look, there's a fantastic resource. I know Naveen and I have used it gratuitously, and it's a historical diary of the Khalsa Diwan Society, which is the umbrella organization for not just the Sikh community but the wider South Asian community in the early 1910s, and really was one of the only organizations. And if you look through their meeting minutes and their history, there's a small, it's a note that you could pass over if you weren't looking carefully, because it's one tiny sentence. And that tiny sentence is dated September 1913, September 28th. And it says in Punjabi, it says, okay, it's very small and I don't have my glasses on, so I will just read it in English. And it says that Bhai Bishan Singh should be given the Guru Granth Sahib, the extra Guru Granth Sahib that is here being the Gurdwara in Vancouver, the main Gurdwara at that time. So just a little tiny note back in September 1913 tells us that Bhai Bishan Singh, Baba Sundar Singh, who I showed you a picture of earlier, received a sarup, a manuscript of the Guru Granth Sahib, the scripture of the Sikh faith, in 1913 to start this Gurdwara in New Westminster. And a few times later in this year, it'll go on, and you'll see where in the meeting minutes, it'll say how this Gurdwara should be run, and et cetera, et cetera. So 1913 is when we see this Gurdwara come to be. And the reason that we celebrate 1919 as the date of the Gurdwara's centennial is because of the special date right here, March 4th. And Naveen, you can just let me know if you can see it. It's right here, 1919, March 4th. Bhai Bishan Singh, up until this point in 1913, had been running the Gurdwara out of his home. So the Guru Granth Sahib he received from Vancouver was installed in its own home, and it acted as the place of worship for the Sikhs at this time. On March 4th, 1919, Bhai Bishan Singh bought the plot of land next to his house, and he donated it for $1, or he sold it for $1 to the Khalsa Diwan Society. And that was to be used from that time forward as the Gurdwara formally. So that's why we celebrate the 100th anniversary, or that's why we mark the 100th anniversary in 2019, even though the Gurdwara had been going on for 6 years before that.
This is a fascinating story, Paneet, and thank you for illuminating it for us, because it speaks to two things, for me at least. The humble origins of the Gurdwara in Westminster. I assume it was a home, and then it moved into the space where it is now. But also that moment of those early 1900s and the 1913s, the Gurdwara that was in Vancouver, of course, the issue of the Kamagara and World War I, 1919 being a period when the New Westminster Gurdwara had its permanent space, but also the Gurdwara in Paldi, I believe, Paneet, if I'm not correct, if I'm not wrong, also originates from 1919 too. So there's a moment here where Gurdwara and the community is growing, but also in a sense, it's putting down roots. Would you agree with that, Paneet?
Sorry, I just missed that last part.
Oh, would you agree that 1919 and that time period was a moment when the community was putting down roots?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a lot of firsts going on in US, but there's one that's pretty interesting that I want to show a picture of down here, and it's a couple of decades in the future. It's 1950. We'll see a fantastic picture right here of a familiar face, a face that you and I know very well, Naveen, and that's Mrs. Naseeb Kaurpuri, and her high school graduation picture in 1950. Because in 1950, in New Westminster, the first ever woman of South Asian descent graduates from high school in the province, and that's of course Mrs. Nasib Korpuri, who we're so lucky that that they're on the call today with us. So thank you for being with us. I'm wondering, BBG, if you'd like to share a little bit about your school experience in New Westminster. Of course, you don't have to, but if you do, you're more than welcome to. Oh, we have her muted. Michelle, you think we'd be able to request an unmute?
I've clicked it a few times, but it doesn't seem to be working.
Oh, okay.
We'll try to figure that out, Mrs. Puri. It might be on your side to have to unmute the microphone, but don't worry, because we'll come to you later on again as well, because there are so many parts of the exhibit that depend on your work. So hopefully we can get that figured out on your side to unmute. But it really is an evocative photograph, and really all these images here, Paneet, I think speak to the visual history of the community changing over time. I'm curious, Paneet, if you can consider moving the camera to the left here, and we pan across, and could you speak a bit about the shastras that we have on display here?
Yeah, there you go. So the idea here was, when you walk into a Gurdwara space, at the center of the congregation hall or the Darbar hall will be the Guru Granth Sahib. Will be the Guru Granth Sahib will be installed, and before the Guru Granth Sahib will be ceremonial weapons, decorative weapons rather, that sit in front. And weaponry, of course, is very as the symbolism of weaponry, and of course, like the practical application in the Sikh faith has been something that's gone on for since its inception, pretty much. So we had the same idea here of having this weaponry installation, kind of documenting the different ways in which weapons are incorporated into the Gurdwara space. So from decorative, this shield and two swords, which often represents standing up for justice, as well as having a sharp spiritual mind, to over here on the left side, where it's the Sikh article of faith, the Kirpan, that a Sikh, an initiated Sikh, would wear on a regular basis, that are sold at the Gurdwara, that are available for free for those who need them at the Gurdwara as well, that can't afford them. To at the very top, usually during a Sikh wedding ceremony, the groom in most weddings will hold a large ceremonial kirpan. And so this is the one at the very top, that was taken from a wedding in 2016 that happened at the Gurdwara, that the groom carried, a wedding that was at the New Westminster Gurdwara. And then if we go along to the backside, there's also weapons that are used in the martial arts classes that are taught at the Gurdwara. The Sikh martial art known as Gatka, which also has a long tradition here, because Naveen, you talked about Baldi earlier, and they used to have the annual Jod Mela and the sports tournaments in the village of Baldi on Vancouver Island, where a lot of people would participate in Gatka as well. So that continues today at New West Gurdwara, where these shields, which you can see are well weathered. I don't know if you can tell on the stream, but these are used by kids who are learning this martial art at the Gurdwara today. And unlike the decorative weapons, these ones are well worn, and they've been used quite a lot by the kids. So that's why we have this installation of weaponry in the middle of the exhibition.
It really is amazing to see some of this up close, and to notice the history that's embedded in a lot of these artifacts. And one, if you mind just holding the camera there for a second, you also see some of the musical instruments on the far side as well too, that are involved in Kirtan. Now, Paneet, I'm going to ask you to do some fancy maneuvering here to show the picture that's on the wall here of the independence of India. So if you can organize your way to get that picture, I really appreciate it. But this is one of those really important moments in the history of the community, and which is why we've made this sort of large-scale photograph of it. And it speaks to the independence of India from British colonial rule, a movement that had, in many respects, some strands that originated in Western North America, and this celebration of India's freedom and this photograph in particular are taken from the New Westminster Gurdwara. Now, Ms. Puri, I'm curious if you're able to, there's a button on the bottom left corner of your screen that says, it's a microphone button. So if it says mute and unmute. So if you're able to press that button, let me know. And if not, see if it can happen. But I know that the stories that you've shared around this date in particular and how important it's been have been really great. I don't know if you see it or not there, but let me just say that I know that this moment was really a culmination of a lot of political activism, a lot of social activism for the South Asian community for decades. And one thing to keep in mind is that when we look back through history, it might seem like Indian independence from England or for British colonialism was an inevitability. But during those time periods in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, when the struggle really was going on, it wasn't as inevitable as it seemed. So this moment of celebration here at New Westminster Gurdwara, where there's an independence celebration happening, I think really spoke to a sense of accomplishment that a lot of South Asians felt. And we have records, Paneet mentioned the diary of Arjun Singh Chand. We have records of donations that are being sent to political parties for Indian independence that stretch back for decades. And of course, there were people from Vancouver and New Westminster and other parts of British Columbia who went back to India to get involved in that freedom movement. So there definitely was that connection going back and forth. And so the celebration here is a celebration of what happened in India, but it also is a recognition of the Canadian Sikh and Canadian South Asian role in that as well too. Paneet, do you think I'm missing anything here? Paneet, now, Paneet, I think you're on mute.
I am, thanks Naveen. So I know BBG, we want to get your mic unmuted, but it's not working out. So I just want to share, not on your behalf, but something that you've shared with us that we really love. And it's that all this, the meticulous planning that went into planning this big celebration event, and how the community was so involved, and that all of these little like pennants, tiny little triangle flags, and those were cut and strung together by BBG herself. And so that was an incredible contribution to this really iconic photograph that we have here in the space that's massive and huge. And I think one of the main things as we move forward, one of the main things that we wanted to make sure was in the installation space, exhibit space rather, that was a focal point, was this photograph for sure. And I just want to point out, just rounding out this Darbar area, the congregation area, we have a little bit of information just about the everyday celebrations and the large celebrations that happen in the Gurdwara, from community events such as Nagar Kirtans and processions that have been going on for 50 years, to smaller ones, familial ones like weddings. So this was a wedding dress generously donated from a 1978 wedding at the Gurdwara that took place at that time. The new building was only 3 years old, so it was a pretty fresh and new Gurdwara. That family lives in Coquitlam now, and as well, if you come into the exhibition space, there's also their photo album, and this was something that we had talked about a lot. Naveen, do you want to talk a little bit about why we chose to have the actual photo albums as opposed to just printed photographs?
Absolutely, Paneet. And it speaks to a bit about the consultation process that we had building up to this exhibit. And one of the things that really became apparent is when we put up questions in one of our consultation sessions about what are some of the important moments that you remember about the Gurdwara, many times personal memories would come across, weddings, celebrations, major festivals. And it was one of those things where we really wanted to have a tangible marker of what that could look like. And these photo albums to us felt like the best way to have that physical document, that physical artifact, if you can say, that could recognize that story. And in another way, it's a personal connection of how those documents, how these photographs were maintained and kept and in many ways preserved for decades. It's interesting when you think about it, because so much of this exhibit is built on material that isn't in public archives. It's in personal archives, and relied upon Paneet and myself to some extent, and also the team at the New Westminster Museum and Archives, to build that trust with the community, so that we could go to people who had given us these wonderful stories and say, would you mind loaning us for a time period a wedding outfit or these personal photographs to help exemplify some of the stories that we want to share. And so in many respects, I'm glad to hear that this could be here in that regard, to give us that physical, tangible sort of history of of how people have kept these stories alive, these memories alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was such a light bulb moment for us when I was like, well, the albums themselves are the artifacts. And it was fantastic to incorporate them. And we'll see a few more of them this close to the end. Right before we move into our next space, which is the Langar Hall / classroom space, I just want to point out one thing, and why it's so, just why it was such a wonderful experience working with this particular team. When you work with local artists who are kind of immersed in the story, you get little nuances that you probably wouldn't in other situations. One of them is, I just want to point you to Anuj Chauhan's graphic design. A lot of the embellishments of along the edges and borders of a lot of these graphics are taken from Punjabi textile practices like fulkaris. And of course, when you have a designer that is part of their lived experience and has that conscientiousness to incorporate that into the design of not just, again, the artifacts, but also the actual text, it was quite a wonderful experience. And it brings a wonderful narrative together. So here we are in our next spot, and we're going to talk a little bit about Paneet Singh, who's a big part of this New Westminster history. You want to kick that off a little bit, Naveen?
I will.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Ms. Puri.
Okay, cool.
And thank you so much, Badge. Thank you so much, Mr. Puri, for all your help with that too. Before we speak to that, I'm curious, Ms. Puri, if you would like to share some of your thoughts so far on. I'll give you a moment. I'll give you a moment. Sure, for sure. And Ms. Puri, thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much, Badge, for making this work as well too. I know that some of this computer stuff is frustrating for me as well. So thank you for making the opportunity.
I don't do it. Yeah, there was a couple of things while you were talking that I wanted to say on. Well, the Independence Day, that was a very big thing, and the whole community came together, and everybody was very, very happy about it, and enjoyed doing all the parts they had. So it's good. And also about the first weddings, I just, as you spoke on that, it just came to me that I did have a picture of one of the very early pictures of, actually it was the first wedding in New Westminster. I have that picture. I was going through some just the other day, a lot of old pictures, and I came across it and I thought, gee, I should have given you that, but I will now, and if you can fit it in anywhere. It's a picture of the bride and groom and all the congregation and all the people that were at the wedding, standing behind them on the same stairs as that picture there of the Freedom Day.
That is amazing, Ms. Puri. That's amazing. And I do want to go back to Paneet's earlier question about high school. What was that school experience like?
School experience was very good. I remember even from grade 1 on, I never had any kind of problems. I was always very, very mixed in with the community. I never had any racial problems or anything. No one ever said anything to me. And, even I never thought I was any different. And school was good. Yes, I enjoyed, I was the only one in the high school.
Yeah.
Uh,
I can imagine it was quite an experience. And you must have had this ability because you also knew English and Punjabi in the Gurdwara space. Tell us about that was like.
You mean the schooling in the Gurdwara? But that didn't start until later. But in grade 1, I did not know any English at all. And if anybody came that spoke Punjabi, I was the one that spoke and talked to them and carried on a conversation and related it to the teacher. So even in grade 1, I was sort of a interpreter. So to me, school was really very important, and I enjoyed going, and I had no problems of any sort. And learning was really, when I realized I could write my name in English and all that, it was quite an experience. So I can't say anything, bad about school experiences. I never had any ones that I could say that I did not enjoy.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Mrs. Puri. And I wanted to ask one more question. And Paneet, perhaps we can go back to these images of by Mewa Singh. And Ms. Puri, perhaps I can ask you to comment after Paneet and I share some of the images that we have on display here, because in many respects, one in particular, I think, is one that has never been shown before. Paneet, may I ask you perhaps to tell our audience a bit about the Mewa Singh story?
Yeah, so the Mewa Singh story is very, it's usually regarded as like kind of the end of the Kamagata Maru episode, where Mewa Singh, who was a resident of Vancouver in 1914, in retaliation for the Kamagata Maru, and not just that, but a lot of violence that was taking place in the South Asian community at the hands of government informants and those kinds of things. Mewa Singh assassinated an immigration officer of the Canadian for the Canadian government by the name of William C. Hopkinson, who was an interpreter for the Canadian government. And so Hopkinson was not just an interpreter, but also responsible for a lot of espionage into the South Asian community, a lot of disruption into the South Asian community, and often was at the center of a lot of violent conflict that was taking place. And so to put a stop to the violence, Mewa Singh assassinated William C. Hopkinson, essentially turned himself into the authorities, and on January 11th, 1915, was hanged to death by the Canadian government. And that took place just 2 blocks up from where I'm standing right now, at the Anvil Center at the corner of Royal and 8th. And so this area of the exhibition are some artifacts that are relevant to Mewa Singh. So if we look at what we've collected, these are all specifically relevant to Mewa Singh's time in New West, and that's because he was arrested here. He was arrested and brought to the provincial jail that was here. He was hanged here, and of course he was here while he was imprisoned from October to January. His funeral, which is pictured here, and I don't know if can you see that, Naveen? Is it clear enough?
It comes clear, yes, Paneet.
Great. It took place at the Fraser Mills, of course, which is used to be its own municipality, and now it's on the border of Coquitlam in New West. And then down here, I'm going to let you tell a story about this ticket in a second, Naveen, because obviously you were there. But on the bottom, there's also a letter that a translation of a letter that Mewa Singh wrote while he was in jail in New West, and he wrote that to the community, the South Asian community in Stockton, California, because at that time South Asian migration was happening all up and down the west coast of North America. So the community was from here all the way down to California is where most of the South Asian Sikh community lived. And so at that time, Nameless Singh wrote a 1.5-page letter to the congregation there before he was hanged. And so a translation of that letter, and then this interesting ticket in the middle, Naveen, and I'll frame up the camera if you want to tell a little story about that ticket.
Absolutely, Paneet. Thank you for that. And I just want to note, Mrs. Puri, you're on unmuted. Your microphone is muted once again. So I would invite you to maybe have Badge come and help unmute it, because I'd love to get your thoughts on the story in a bit. Because this ticket that Paneet is framing up right now is really evocative of the story of the Kalmagaram Room, but also by Nameless Singh. And as far as I know, it's the very first time that this has ever been put on display. And as Paneet mentioned, this is a ticket that was given to A.J. Stevenson, who was a sheriff at that time in Vancouver. This is a ticket to come and view the hanging of Nameless Singh. And this actual physical artifact is in the Royal BC Museum. And when you go and search about the story of Nameless Singh, the photograph above that Paneet has shown of the cremation is there, as well as this ticket. And what's really evocative about it is that, for one, I had no idea that there was tickets given to see the viewing of Nameless Singh, but it really personalizes the story in a lot of different ways. It gives the date, the time of the hanging, and the location as well too. And now we don't know how many tickets were given. We don't know how many people had come to see the hanging, whether it was a public event, whether it was a private event. But in many ways, this artifact is something I had never seen before. And we were really lucky that the generous support we had from the Royal BC Museum Archives was able to bring us this ticket to showcase, because it really is something that was touched by someone who was at the hanging of Nameless Singh. And there are other photographs in the exhibit. One that comes to mind is the photograph of the funeral procession that took place after the hanging through the streets of New Westminster, right by the roads where the current Anvil Center is now, to the space where the cremation took place. And on the left-hand side here, Paneet has framed up mug shots of Nameless Singh that were, again, we were really lucky with the timing of this exhibit, because if it happened 3 years ago, this image would never be there. But it's a picture taken of Nameless Singh. Paneet, did you want to tell us about this story?
Yeah, so this, again, all the artifacts here are relevant to Nameless Singh's time, specifically in New Westminster. And this was the day that Nameless Singh shot William C. Hopkinson. He was brought to the provincial jail here in New West, and his mugshots were taken that day. So this picture is from October 21st, 1914, that day, moments after Nameless Singh made this kind of life-altering decision, and kind of history-altering decision, to assassinate William C. Hopkinson. And again, these both the ticket and this image in the lab have both only come to light in the last 5 years, despite the story again being over 100 years old. Because of, sometimes where things end up when they're related to colonial history. For a story in New Westminster, and because it carried such large implications, we find this piece of New Westminster history in the British side. And so it's interesting how that works out. And also a little full circle is that when we came across this ticket for Nameless Singh's hanging the first time, was back in 2015, late 2014. And the only reason we came across it was because of the help of the New Westminster Museum and Archives, because it's mislabeled at the Royal BC Museum. So because Nameless Singh was spelled wrong, incorrectly 100 years ago, or whenever it was entered into there was an accession number sitting on a random document in the archives here that pointed towards this ticket, and it's the only reason we found it. So how fitting that New Westminster Museum is where it's displayed for the first time for the public to see.
It's a great point, Paneet. Ms. Puri, I'm glad to hear you're back on. Did you want to share a bit about the story?
Yes,
too?
I did, especially about the hanging. My father was there. He told me, these are stories that I have learned from my father. And he said when he was being hung, all the people were standing outside singing Shabd, but inside, when Meva Singh was being, when it came time to for the actual hanging, he was singing Shabd, and whatever there was some board or something on the bottom, he kicked it with his own foot. He didn't wait for the hangman to do anything for him, and he was, and also that he had gained 5 pounds, 4 to 5 pounds, waiting for this execution because he was so proud of what he had done for the community.
That's an amazing story, Mrs. Puri.
And he, like my dad was outside with a lot of the community.
That's amazing. Ms. Puri, I'm curious if you can share with us how Mewa Singh's death was commemorated by the community for years afterwards. Was there a day that it was marked?
Yes, every year in May usually, there at the Millside Gurdwara, they always had a kanpat, and that was to remember the day that he was executed. And everybody came, all the communities. There weren't that many people that at that time in BC, but whenever every Gurdwara shared different occasions that happened, like Fraser Mills was the one that they got from Mewa Singh, and it was every May. And even us as school children, we were in the Punjabi school then in grade 3 or 4, all of us. There was maybe 20 of us at that time, and we were taught to go to the Gurdwara on that day and sing these special shabd as we went in to about Mewa Singh, about the good deed he had done. So
I'm curious, Mrs. Puri, if you still remember those shabds that you were taught back then.
you want me to sing it? No, it was, well, we would all go in before we matha tek at the Gurdwara, and we would sing Mewa Singh ne Mewa Laya, Mewa Singh ne Mewa Laya, Papi Mar Makaya, Hopkinson ne Julm Kamaya, Mewa Singh ne Mewa Laya, Papi Mar Makaya. And we sang that as we went in. And we were taught all the whatever our Gyani that was teaching us Punjabi taught us about Mewa Singh. We all knew these little bits. There's maybe just a few of us around still. So it was quite moving for us that this had happened as children.
It's an amazing story, and I'm so glad that you were able to share that with us.
And we always had that picture that you have of his funeral hanging in our living room. My father always wanted it there. It always hung in our living room, and that was always a reminder of why we were all enjoying the fruits of this beautiful country.
So well said. I'm monitoring a bit of the chat room, and I want to acknowledge that Sharanjit Sandra over at the Abbotsford Museum is a big fan of yours as well too. So we're just really lucky, Mrs. Puri, to have you on this video to share your stories. Paneet?
Yeah, and I just want to point out that the kavta or the poem that was shared to us by Naseeb Kaurji is also written on the walls of the exhibition. Just a couple of lines. Aj din ji shahidi aaya Mewa Singh.
Yes, that's how, actually I missed that part. That's how we should, I should have said, yes.
Yeah,
Aj din ji shahidi aaya Mewa Singh ne Mewa laya, Papi Mar Makaya.
Yeah, so you could
Hopkinson ne Julm Kamaya, Mewa Singh ne Mewa laya, Papi Mar Makaya. I forgot that. That's how it starts.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, so much for sharing it. I mean, it's only because of you sharing it that we had it on the walls to begin with. And I want to talk a little bit about these quotes on the wall. And also our other guest here is Arvinder Kaur, whose contribution also helped us put this exhibition together so much. And a lot of this Punjabi school space, which is really important to the history of the Gurdwara. Of course, now it's a full functioning, multiple classes Punjabi school, but at one time it was just the Granthi or the caretaker of the Gurdwara, the scripture reader, just teaching in the dining hall, the langar hall. And I wanted to share this fantastic quote from Ms. Rawinder Kaur, and then maybe you can share a little bit of some of your memories from the Gurdwara with us as well. This was from an oral history that we collected. I think you sat with Wana Kapoda, the curator of the museum. And you said, I remember my brother Paul and I got Punjabi lessons when we got home from school. We had to learn the alphabet and how to write it and read it and say it, which I really liked. At that time, I didn't realize how important it would become, because when my father stayed in India for 10 years, that was my only means of communicating with them through letters. And that was just such a beautiful sentiment that you shared. Could you share a little bit about that that learning experience and your relationship with the Gurdwara? You were living there when you first.
That's right. Yes, my dad had come to the Gurdwara in 1959 and had been asked to come and do the service there. And he was there by himself for 3 years, and then the rest of us family joined him in 62. So I was about 4 years old when I came.
Hi, Raj. Not bad, thanks. I'm down here. This one. Okay.
Please continue.
Continue. Can you shut this door?
Shall I? Yes.
Please.
So yeah, basically, we lived at the temple. That was our home. So every morning was a ritual where, we would wake up and go and do Matha Chekana. My dad would be at the altar, and that was how our day started. And walking through the streets of, Queensborough was very, very unique environment there, because it was so multicultural. We knew so many people from Italy and Greece and Russia and, people from all over the world. And even though we didn't always have a common language, everyone was just very welcoming towards each other. And we really felt a sense of community. And then my father became very involved in, actually, when he first got there, the congregation and the people that attended the temples was very, very minuscule. And it just didn't have a lot of structure and a lot of sort of services and different things that were happening there. And I think my dad was very good at providing some of that, mentoring, and as well, because he was also a musician, as well as my mom and my brother who played tabla. So we used to also do kirtan as well, the hymns in the Gurdwara. So my dad would do the wedding. So there were all kinds of things that started happening that were really getting developed, and I think it became much more of a central place to meet and visit. And we could see over the time that I was there, how many more people began to come there, and it started getting to be that really a much more important sense of a meeting place for people to come together and share, in these common sort of history and past. So yeah, we had the typical thing in the home, where my parents spoke mostly the Punjabi, and then of course myself, I attended kindergarten here. So, and I agree with like what Mrs. Buri was saying, is that, there is a role reversal, because we become translators for our parents. So in a sense, they lose some of that parental power, of being the parent, because all of a sudden now they're sort of relying on their small young children to kind of be in that role of creating that, gate bridge between two cultures. And I think that must have been very hard for them, but I think they also appreciated that we would be able to do that. It was a little tougher for my brother and my sister, the older ones, because they didn't speak English when they came. They were a little bit older, so they actually got put back 3 grades, and that was very, very hard. So that, so my sister, when she got into high school, she was actually much older than all the other girls in the class. So I think that was hard for her. And also for my brothers, it was a big adjustment. Not so much in Queensborough, but when we moved to New Westminster and went to Lord Tweensmere and then New West Secondary, Vincent Massey, very typical. We were like a very small, percentage of the whole school. Like if we weren't the only South Asians in the class, we were pretty much near the only ones in the class. So we were a bit of an oddity. I think people were curious about our background and our culture, but I think that we didn't know that much about it back then. I think there was a bit of sort of not really belonging, you know, in that environment a bit more so. But overall, you know, I think we did the best we could in adjusting. I think it was a bit harder for the boys just because of, you know, with the turbans and, you know, that sort of thing. I think a lot of kids just really didn't understand what that was all about. But very fascinating. Yeah, very. And my dad was one of the ones that was teaching the Punjabi schools. And he did make a point of, you know, he got very angry one day because none of us were speaking Punjabi. And so he said, that's it. No more English in the house. That's it. We're speaking Punjabi from now on. And, you know, as I wrote in my my little quote there, boy, he must have had some vision, because who would have known that all of these things would have happened, and he would have been back in India and we would have been here and having no other way of communicating. This would have been, I guess, from 1972 to about 82 that he was there.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And imagine, just like you said, you know, where some ideas originate from and the impact that happens over the course of so many years and decades until today. I just want to be also a bit cognizant of time, because I know we have to wrap up in about 5 to 10 minutes or so. Paneet, I'm curious, is there anything you want to add about that space?
Just very quickly, thank you so much for sharing. It's such valuable insight and such a unique experience that you're probably one of 2-3 families maybe ever to actually live at the Gurdwara in the last 100 years. So it's such valuable insight. And so just going on towards when you come to the exhibition space, this used to be an interactive area before COVID. Now, not so much, but it used to be a place where you could come and try to learn and practice Punjabi. The actual permanent writing on the side is something that you would find in maybe like the first 1 or 2 lessons of a Punjabi class. And we actually got Deep Singh Sangra, who's a longtime New Westminster resident, and started the New Westminster Punjabi School formally as it exists today in the 1980s. I think 1983, if I'm not mistaken. It's on the timeline. You can check it out if you come. But it's been quite a long time, and he ran it for decades. And it was through that the New Westminster Punjabi School that a lot of the activism to get Punjabi as an accredited school course in elementary schools and high schools actually took place. And so now you can take it at New Westminster Secondary, you can take it in post-secondary. A lot of that activism was grassroots activism that was sparked by Punjabi schools like New Westminster's, which was one of the bigger ones. And the last thing kind of just about this area, rounding it out, is a lot of the 50s and 60s that we have an idea of are mostly because of 2 families. One, of course, Arvinderji, because of your family, and the other, Gyani Mani Singh, and then the Granthi that followed up, Gyani Sujan Singh, right behind him, who was a big part of the 1970s for the Gurdwara. And a lot of the consultations that we had were filled with beautiful, loving, positive memories of Gyani Sujan Singh. Retired in the mid-1980s after moving to Canada in 1957. So he had quite a long service here, and his family generously donated some of his possessions or loaned them rather for the exhibition, his turban, his pens, a few of his articles of faith, as well as his notebook. And you can see his penmanship for anyone who reads Gurmukhi is incredible and it's beautiful. So it's definitely something to come check out. And that kind of rounds out that area, and it kind of comes together with this little last piece right here, which is kind of the bridge between the education and the spiritual, which is something that is another installation that's evocative of something you would see in a Gurdwara. I'll just step off screen, you probably can't see me with the light. And that is prayer books or Gutka sides. And these Gutkas, or these 2 particularly, came from the actual Gurdwara now. And it speaks to a couple of things, so I just want to touch on it very quickly. What the Gutkas have at the top, the prayer at the top, is one that's used at the Gurdwara on a regular basis for a weekly recitation of for a for a writing called Sukhmani Sahib, which is often led by Sikh women, and it is at New West as well every single week, and it's been going on for decades. And at the bottom is actually a commentary. It's called Siddhantik Steep, which is a commentary on the writing of the Gurus. And this one in particular was done by Arvinderji's father, Gyani Mani Singh. And it's used by scholars across the world, traditional Sikh scholars, and it's like 10 volumes. And a copy of it exists at the current New Westminster Gurdwara as well. So we thought that was a great little installation. And I just want to give a shout out to New Westminster Museum and Archives for being very cognizant of the protocols and practices of handling these texts. And so they're installed behind glass, so you can't, like passersby can't touch them. And also the installation and wrapping up in the evening, or prakashan sukhasan as we call them in Punjabi, is done every day by staff. That's by Sikh staff at the New Westminster Museum and Archives, heads covered and hands washed. So it's a very respectful practice, and I think something that we strive for in museums going forward.
That's amazing, Paneet, and thank you for highlighting that work with the New Westminster Museum and Archives that they do to thoughtfully take care of these donations that are given by the community, in many respects for the very first time, and then the care that's taken in a lot of specifically the religious artifacts as well too. We've given a bit of a virtual tour of the exhibit, Oceans of Peace, and because of COVID-19 and the restrictions that were in place, and because the museum, just because of safe practice, had to be closed for a certain period of time, we want to let you know that this exhibit has now been extended until pretty much the end of December. So if anybody wants to go down and see a lot of these artifacts that we mentioned in a cursory way, whether it's the photo albums, whether it's reading in detail the timeline and the history of the community, or if it's the tickets to view the execution, or anything new that might be added over the next 6 weeks or so, please come down to the Anvil Center and see the exhibit that is really the community's exhibit that Paneet and I and the staff here have really been honored to share with all of you.
Can I just say, I remember the day Gyani Mani Singh ji and family arrived from India to New Westminster Gurdwara. It was a great day. Everybody was so happy, and to have somebody so learned to come and take over and work in this Gurdwara. And on the very first day, even with all the travel and everything, they did Kirtan the very first day they arrived at the Gurdwara. And I'm proud to say I was there and I heard it.
No, you look familiar. I recognize you. Yeah.
I remember you as a little girl.
Bubbly. That was my nickname. Bubbly.
Exactly. I remember that now.
Yeah, I haven't changed much.
You're still bubbly.
Still talkative and bubbly, yeah.
Very nice, very nice. And I have the book your father has written when he was in Amritsar at Khalsar. I visited him in India. And he gave me the book that he had written. I have it here.
Well, he's written many, many books, but
I know, but this is the first one.
The Unmoldable.
Unmoldable.
Oh,
Yes,
I'm looking for another copy of that. I haven't been able to find one.
Well, I have one here.
Oh, you lucky.
Yeah.
That's great.
I can let you have it if you want.
Oh, lovely, lovely. I love it. Okay,
I'll just note, this is a great end to the conversation, this connection that just happened here. And I will draw people's attention over to the Zoom chat room, which has a link to how you can book a safe time to come and visit the exhibit. The New Westminster Museum and Archives has all the precautions in place for COVID-19, for hand washing, for masks and everything else. But Wednesday to Sunday from 10 to 5 p.m., you can book a visit to come see the exhibit. Paneet, am I missing anything?
No, thank you so much. I think that was a perfect place to end it. Conversations like this during the whole consultation process was something that we were so fortunate to see when people from different decades and different times or haven't seen each other in like 40 years got to see each other again. And so that's the kind of energy that we're bringing to this space. So thank you so much for joining us, both of you. It's really appreciated. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And thank you, of course, the New Westminster Museum and Archives. We can hand it back over to Michelle, I think, if that's all.
Thank you so much.
Now I'm having issues with my muting. Well, thank you so much. That was an amazing conversation and contribution by everyone involved. Thank you, Paneet and Naveen, for being our fearless leaders in your curatorial work and your research and your practice, and Mrs. Puri and Arwinder for your wonderful connections, your conversation, and it really deepens everything that we see within the exhibition. Again, if anybody has any questions, I haven't quite seen anything come up in the chat. I don't know if anybody sent anything to you privately, Naveen or Paneet. I haven't seen anything to the group. Okay. Oh, somebody is saying, Laura is saying, it's very interesting, thank you. There are many parallels with Japanese Canadian history. For sure, a lot of the histories are interwoven and there are a lot of parallels. That's a really great point. Arjun is asking the name of the steek. Does that mean something to either of you, Paneet or Naveen?
Yeah, I can just quickly. It's called Siddhantak Steek Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, and the author, if you're looking for it on Google, would be Singh Sahib Gyani Mani Singh.
Great, thank you. And does anybody else have any other questions? I'll give you just a second to write that in the chat. But again, thank you, Naveen, for pointing out. I did put the information for booking in the chat, and we are open Wednesday to Sunday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Each booking consists of up to 6 people, so up to 5 people, including yourself, within your bubble, and that does include children and babies. They do count. So it is very safe. We have a strict sanitization schedule, and you get your own basically private viewing of all the exhibitions. And Oceans of Peace is open until December, so we're really excited to have that extended. Really feeling very fortunate for that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And now that I see that Juana is also on the screen, I know you enjoyed us the entire time, but Juana, I want to thank you, Rob, Michelle, thank you for this wonderful opportunity, yourselves and your entire team at the Westminster Museum and Archives for allowing this story to be shared, and hopefully we can continue the conversation as we move forward too.